Okay, so good. I don't know what time it is in Australia and New Zealand.
Tomorrow morning.
Can they hear us?
Yes.
Yes.
9 a.m.
So it's 7 p.m. Here in Ottawa. Thank you so much for joining us for this meeting, which is the 9th meeting of the committee. Earlier today, we heard from. We heard about the international experience, namely how things are done in Ireland, and we're very interested to better understand how your electoral systems work in Australia and New Zealand. So we'll be starting with Australia, I believe. Okay, Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers was appointed as the Australian Electoral Commission's Electoral Commissioner in December 2014 for a 5-year term. The Commission is responsible for conducting federal elections and referenda and maintaining the electoral roll, or what might otherwise be known as the registry, and engaging in a range of education programs and activities about the country's electoral system. The Senate uses single transferable vote, while the House of Representatives uses alternative vote. Am I correct, Mr. Rogers, in my understanding of how things work in Australia?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. Well, the floor is yours for 20 minutes, and as I said, we're very interested to learn what you will be discussing.
Thank you very much, Chair, members, and also the New Zealand Electoral Commissioner. Good morning from Canberra. Thanks for the invitation to appear today. As members of the committee may be aware, and as you've just said, I'm the Commissioner of the Australian Electoral Commission, also known as the AEC, which is how I will refer to it today. I'm responsible for federal elections, referendums in Australia, and in Australia we also have 7 other electoral commissions at the state and territory level, and I'm also responsible for certain industrial elections as well, but I won't be talking about that today. I understand your mandate is to examine viable alternative voting systems, mandatory voting and electronic voting, and in my opening statement today I'll touch on all of those in some way, but first I might just explore the Australian electoral system a little more. As you've mentioned, at federal level, we have a bicameral system with a lower house, the House of Reps, an upper house, the Senate, and both houses are elected by the people, but using 2 different systems of voting. In the House of Reps, we have a full preferential voting system. It requires a voter to individually number and rank all candidates according to their preferences, and then a candidate is elected if they gain more than 50% of the formal vote. If a candidate doesn't gain 50% of the vote based on first preferences, the candidate with the least number of votes is excluded, and their preferences are then distributed, and the process of preference distribution continues until a candidate achieves more than 50% of the vote. Now, under this system, a voter must complete all boxes on the ballot paper for their vote to be formal and included in the count. Of course, some voters don't include all the boxes, and we refer to this as an informal vote. Now, there are savings provisions in the legislation that can save certain votes in certain circumstances. However, some ballot papers do remain informal, and the rate of informality is relatively low and consistent at around about 5% at federal elections for the House of Representatives. The 2016 election, which we're still in the process of conducting, the informality rate hasn't been determined, but I'm expecting it to be around the same, if not slightly less in some cases. But in some individual seats, the rate of informality remains high, and there are various factors impacting on that informality, and I'm happy to expand on that if members are interested later on. In the Senate, we use a system of proportional representation to elect candidates. And essentially, this system elects a number of candidates to represent one constituency after receiving a set proportion of the vote. For over 3 decades, group voting tickets were used to support a system where a voter's preference continued until all vacant positions were filled. However, in March of this year, new legislation introduced a partial preferential system which enabled voters to determine where their preferences flowed and finished. In my view, it was one of the largest changes to the Australian electoral system since 1984, and we had 4 months to implement that in time for a 2 July election this year. There are various elements to this reform, including the introduction of ballot paper scanning for the first time at a federal level in Australia, and the implementation of a very large national education campaign. Again, I'm happy to discuss that later if the committee are interested. In recent weeks, there's been some external commentary within Australia at least about the perception that the AEC is not making sufficient progress with the count of results for a federal election. I do want to clarify that the speed of the AEC's count is driven by the Electoral Act itself, and not because of the type of preferential and proportional voting system that we have. Yes, conducting a count under a preferential system can take longer than a count under the first-past-the-post system. However, the period of time that it takes to finalise the result is more due to other aspects of our legislation. Most notably, a voter can pretty much vote from anywhere in Australia or around the world for their home electorate. And so to facilitate this, the AEC then undertakes a complex exchange of votes after the election. Votes can also be received up to 13 days after election day, and the AEC is responsible for sending these votes to the correct division where the voter's entitlement to vote is confirmed. So that means you can vote on one side of Australia, but before that vote can be physically counted, I have to send the vote physically over to the other side of Australia to its home division before it can be counted. Now, all of that must occur before the counting of those votes can even commence, and in addition, the number of early votes now being cast continues to rise, and this has significant logistical impacts. So all of those envelopes need to be got back to their home division, and it creates difficulties for us. Mandatory voting. I'll now move to the subject of mandatory voting. In Australia, we refer to that as compulsory voting. In Australia, it is compulsory to enrol and to vote at federal elections. Compulsory enrolment at the federal level for Australian citizens was introduced in 1918, followed by compulsory voting in 1924. At the last election, we estimate that about 95% of all eligible electors are enrolled, about 15.6 million people. That is the largest number of electors we've ever had enrolled, and probably the most complete electoral roll we've ever had in Australia's history. It's the responsibility of every individual to update their own enrolment details. However, we also have a system of federal direct enrolment and update, and that assists that process. We use trusted third-party data, such as driver's licence information, to enrol or update an elector's details. Now, under current legislation, there is no avenue really for successful prosecution of eligible electors who are not enrolled. And the reason I say that is that enrolment is an absolute defence for any charge of not enrolling. So what we find is if we go down the process of taking someone to court, quite often they'll essentially enrol on the courthouse steps, which is then an absolute defence for non-enrolment. Compulsory voting and enrolment is seen as a normal part of Australian political culture. There is lots of evidence to suggest continued support for compulsory voting, and I think in 2013, the last time we did surveys, about 70% of the population or thereabouts indicated support for compulsory voting. At the most recent federal election, which we've just had, turnout was around about 90%. But we'll have to confirm that over the coming weeks as we finish the processes with that election. Under our system of compulsory voting, those enrolled electors who did not vote are sent a non-voter letter. It requires the elector to either respond, providing a valid excuse for not voting, or paying a very small $20 fine. A small number of those voters who don't pay the fine are then prosecuted, and I think at the last election we went through a full prosecution with about 3,000 people. In Australia, our Electoral Matters Committee has considered the issue of voluntary voting a number of times. However, the issue has never been pursued by our federal parliament. I might move now to electronic voting. Electronic voting is a matter for the Australian Parliament, not for the AEC, and it would require a change to our legislation. At federal level, we do not use electronic voting, nor do we use internet voting. In 2014, our Electoral Matters Committee inquired into the topic of electronic voting, and if I just quote from that for one moment, it found that irrespective of one's philosophical view, there can be no widespread introduction of electronic voting in the near term without massive costs and unacceptable security risks. However, in recent weeks, our Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have both pledged their support for examining some form of electronic voting, again following perceptions about the length of time it takes for us to return the result. I cannot speculate as to what model would be introduced, how it would be introduced, or when. It's a matter for Parliament. At state and territory level, some commissions have trialled electronic voting. In the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is located, electronic voting has been used in early voting centres since 2001. They use a system of personal computers. And in New South Wales, internet voting was trialled in 2011 and 2015 for particular categories of voters, those that have a disability and those that are more than 20 kilometres from a polling place. My understanding is that well over 250,000 voters availed themselves of internet voting at the New South Wales state election, at the last state election. I am aware of significant media commentary surrounding security aspects of this system, but I'm unable to comment further. I don't own that system. We don't have electronic voting, but many aspects of our electoral process are already electronic. We've enabled voters to enrol online for a number of years, and voters can also apply for a postal vote online. The increased use of electronic forms by the Australian community has simplified the process of these transactions without diminishing the controls in place. We also introduced the scanning of Senate ballot papers for the first time in the 2016 election, and as I'm speaking to you, we are still running very large scanning centres in each of the states, scanning Senate ballot papers for the 2016 election. We've also deployed at the last two elections electronic certified lists. These are an electronic version of the electoral roll, and it contains a list of electors entitled to vote. I think it's a great initiative, provides the ability to search for and mark off an elector's name, provide a real-time update to a central copy of the certified list, and where we can, print House of Representative ballot papers on demand. At the recent election, we had about 1,500 devices. It is expensive, but worthwhile. Just two other aspects of our electoral system I might touch on just to provide a flavour for what we do. Under the Electoral Act, the Electoral Commission is wholly responsible for undertaking the redistribution of electoral boundaries. It's an apolitical process, has no involvement from political parties or politicians, and in particular, changes to divisional boundaries do not require the approval of Parliament. Submissions and objections to boundaries are invited by consideration. However, the ultimate decision rests with the Electoral Commission, a three-person commission chaired by a judge, and a couple of other people from each state that are thrown in. Another aspect to our work is managing the funding and disclosure regime of our electoral legislation. It includes registration of parties, party logos, and essentially a disclosure of expenditure and returns for an electoral campaign and ongoing during the year. The scheme is designed to inform the public about financial dealings of political parties, candidates and others involved in the process, and we are responsible for managing and running this independent apolitical process. As with other areas of our electoral system, any changes to the funding and disclosure system are also a matter for Parliament. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear today. I'm happy to take any questions or provide any other information that the committee may find helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rogers. We'll now go to Mr. Peden, Chief Electoral Officer in New Zealand, with the New Zealand Electoral Commission, which is an independent body responsible for administering parliamentary elections and referenda, and provide advice. It also engages in public education programs and publishes reports on electoral matters. New Zealand's House of Representatives uses mixed member proportional representation. The first election under MMP was in 1996, prior to which elections had been held under first past the post. So the floor is yours, Mr. Peden.
Thank you, Monsieur le President. Bonjour, tēnā koutou katoa, greetings from New Zealand, and hello to Tom. I propose to speak to some of the slides in the New Zealand Electoral Commission's presentation, specifically slide 5, which deals with the electoral reform process that saw New Zealand adopt the MMP electoral system in 1993. Then slides 8 to 12, which outline the features of New Zealand's particular form of MMP. Then slide 14 on New Zealanders' understanding of MMP, and finally slide 16 on the impact MMP has had on the diversity of the New Zealand Parliament. In the interest of time, I do not propose in these opening remarks to talk to slides 17 to 23 about the 2011 referendum on the voting system and the 2012 review of MMP that occurred as a consequence of that referendum, or to slides 24 and 25, which deal with the issues of compulsory attendance and electronic voting in the New Zealand context. But obviously, I would be happy to take questions on these and any other things later. I hope that what I propose will meet the needs of the committee. Shall I proceed on that basis? Please then turn to slide 5. The electoral reform process that saw New Zealand adopt the MMP electoral system in 1993. The process began with growing public dissatisfaction in the 1970s and early 80s about the perceived fairness of our first-past-the-post system and its tendency to deliver parliaments that did not reflect the nationwide vote. A Royal Commission on the electoral system was established in 1985. It met for 18 months, consulted widely with the public, considered a wide range of reform options, and reported in 1986. It recommended a system of MMP be adopted and that a binding referendum be held at the 1987 general election, giving the voters a choice between first-past-the-post and MMP. A referendum was not held with the 1987 election, but there followed a period of ongoing public and political debate, which included an inquiry by a parliamentary select committee into reform of the electoral system in 1988. Then, in 1991, legislation was introduced providing for a two-step reform process. The first step was an indicative standalone referendum held in September 1992, where New Zealanders were asked two questions. The first question was whether they wanted to change the electoral system. The second question was, irrespective of whether they wanted to change the electoral system, if there were to be a change, which of four systems, MMP, the supplementary member system, the preferential voting system, or the single transferable voting system, would they support? The referendum was preceded by a comprehensive public education campaign undertaken by an independent electoral referendum panel headed by the Chief Ombudsman. Turnout at the referendum was 55.2%, and of those who voted, 84.7% voted for change in question 1 and 70.5% voted for MMP in question 2. The second step in the process was a binding referendum held with the 1993 general election, where voters were asked to choose between first-past-the-post and MMP. Again, the referendum was preceded by a comprehensive public education campaign. Turnout was 85.2% and 54% voted for MMP. As a result, the Electoral Act 1993, providing for an MMP electoral system, which had already been enacted by the New Zealand Parliament in anticipation of this possible outcome, came into force by operation of law. Preparations then began to deliver New Zealand's first MMP election in 1996. A substantial amount of work was required. Not only did the move to MMP require comprehensive revision of the systems and processes for the delivery of elections, Parliament found the need to revisit the 1993 electoral legislation, and after select committee consideration and public consultation, amendments to the legislation were enacted in 1995. Electorate boundaries had to be redrawn to meet the requirements of the new system. Consideration had to be given to the implications of coalition governments and an increase in the number of parliamentary parties likely under the new system for the mechanics of government formation, for cabinet processes and for parliamentary processes. Political parties also needed time to adjust to the different requirements of the new system, including fewer electorates, new nomination processes, and the implications of the party vote for electioneering. And again, a comprehensive public education campaign was required to prepare voters for the new system. I now propose to move to slides 8 to 12 and to outline the features of New Zealand's system of MMP, beginning at slide 8. New Zealand's system of MMP is a moderate form of proportional representation which seeks to balance two important objectives. One is the principle of proportionality, that a party's share of seats should reflect its share of the nationwide vote. The other is the need to ensure elections deliver effective parliaments and stable governments by avoiding the undue proliferation of very small parties in Parliament. A further objective, and one that is fundamental to the mixed member system, is to continue to have local electorate MPs. Therefore, the defining characteristics of MMP are a mix of MPs from single member electorates and those elected from a party list, and a parliament in which parties' shares of seats roughly mirror their share of the nationwide vote. New Zealand has now had 7 MMP elections. Each election has resulted in between 6 and 8 parties represented in Parliament. Each election has resulted in some form of coalition government or arrangement between political parties, as is to be expected under a proportional system. Each government has retained the confidence of the Parliament throughout the parliamentary term. Can we move to slide 9, please? Under MMP, each voter has 2 votes. On the left-hand side of the ballot paper, they vote for the party they most want to represent them in Parliament. Only registered political parties can contest the party vote. On the right-hand side of the ballot paper, they vote for the candidate they most want to represent them in their electorate. Candidates of unregistered parties and independents can contest the electorate vote. Can we move to slide 10, please? New Zealand is currently divided into 71 electorates. Electorate boundaries are reviewed after every 5-yearly population census by an independent representation commission the decision of the Representation Commission on boundaries are final. Electorate seats are won by an electorate on an electorate by electorate basis on a first past the post basis. Can we move to slide 11, please? The party vote is counted on a nationwide basis. To be eligible for an allocation of list seats, a party must win either one electorate seat or 5% or more of the party vote. These are known as the thresholds, and they are intended to avoid the undue proliferation of very small parties in Parliament. So if a party wins 40% of the party vote at an election, for example, the party is entitled to 48 seats in a 120-seat Parliament. If that party's candidates won 30 electorate seats, the party would be topped up with 18 seats from its party list to bring its number of seats in Parliament up to 48. 30 electorate seats plus 18 list seats equals the 48 seats its share of the party vote entitles it to. If another party wins 10% of the party vote and no electorate seats, it is entitled to 12 seats in a 120-seat Parliament, and all those seats come from its party list. A party's list seats are allocated to its candidates in the order they appear on the party's list, excluding those who win an electorate seat. We have included in the background papers provided for members an example of the party list provided to all voters at the 2014 election. Can we move to slide 12, please? There are a number of mathematical formulas available for the allocation of seats in proportional systems. The particular formula adopted by New Zealand is the Salagou formula. We have included in the background papers provided for members an explanation of the method using the 2014 election results as an example, which I think nicely illustrates the process. One thing to note is that New Zealand's system does not prescribe a 120-seat Parliament. The current New Zealand Parliament, for example, has 121 members. This happens where a party wins more electorate seats than it is entitled to under the party vote. Where this happens, the party keeps all its electorate seats, and the number of list seats allocated to other parties is increased by the number of what we call overhang seats. Hence, the current Parliament has 121 members. Can we move to slide 14, please? New Zealanders have, since the adoption of MMP in 1996, demonstrated a practical understanding of how MMP works. We can see this through low levels of informal voting, relatively high levels of split voting or strategic voting, that is, where a voter casts a valid party vote and casts a valid electorate vote for a candidate from a different party. We can see this also through the fact that the overwhelming majority of voters consider the ballot paper layout to be clear, concise, and easy to use. Can we move to slide 16, please? One of the benefits advanced for proportional systems like MMP is that it leads to a more diverse Parliament than tends to result from first past the post and from majoritarian systems. And certainly, as this graph shows, the New Zealand experience is that MMP has resulted in more women and more Māori elected to Parliament. the majority elected as list MPs. So, for example, of all members of Parliament elected to Parliament from party lists, 43% have been women. By contrast, only 24% of MPs elected from electorates have been women. And 21% of all list MPs have identified as Māori, compared with 14% of all electorate MPs. Representation of Pacific and Asian peoples in the New Zealand Parliament has also improved. By way of conclusion, I would suggest that the key lessons from the New Zealand experience are that it is possible to successfully introduce a new electoral system, but, at least in the New Zealand context, the process of reform is very important to public trust and confidence in the outcome, and that the process needs to involve plenty of opportunity for public input, public consultation, and public education. Our experience is that the design and development of different electoral systems raises many points of principle and many points of detail, and these points are all important to people. And that, again, at least in the New Zealand tradition, final decisions are confirmed by the voters at a referendum where they have access to all the details necessary to make an informed decision. And this all takes time. And finally, our experience is that once a decision is made, the time needed for careful planning and implementation to transition to the new electoral system is not to be underestimated, not just for electoral officials, but also for those involved in the administration of executive and parliamentary processes and in the administration of political parties. So, Mr. President, that concludes the introductory comments that I wanted to make. I also am very happy to take questions on any of that or any other matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that very interesting description of how the electoral system works in New Zealand. It's the first time, actually, that I think we've had a witness from a jurisdiction that has mixed member proportional. I think so. It's very enlightening. We have the way we proceed is through 2 rounds of questioning, where each member of the committee gets 5 minutes per round for questions, and but that 5 minutes includes the answer. So it's a 5-minute Q&A per member, and there are 2 rounds. Each round covering all members. So we'll start with Ms. Romanato, please.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you both for joining us from far away, and after spending the day listening about many different types of electoral reform, I think I've just received a crash course on pretty much quite a few of them. So my first question is for Mr. Rogers. You mentioned that you moved for your upper house, your Senate, from a proportional representation to a partial representation, and you had 4 months to implement that. You also implemented ballot paper scanning and had to conduct a very large education campaign. Can you elaborate a little bit on the why you decided to move from proportional representation to partial representation? And can you elaborate a little bit about the decision for the ballot paper, and again regarding the large education campaign that was required?
Certainly, and I should put on record that this is legislative change that was mandated for the Electoral Commission by the Australian Parliament, not a desire for us to do that ourselves, and I'm not making a judgment either pro or anti, it's just a requirement. There was debate in Australia about the Senate voting system at the last election, and again I'm just reflecting. I see that I'm going black on the screen there. I apologise. I hope you can still hear me at least. There was a concern that some members of the Senate were elected with quite a small amount of the primary vote, and so a system was implemented that changed the way Australians vote. So previously, a formal vote in the Senate. That the Senate paper is very long. I think it's over 1 metre long, and there is a line, and above that line are party names and boxes, and below the party boxes are the individual candidates for each of those parties. Previously, Australians could cast a valid vote by just voting one above the line, and then their vote was allocated according to a pre-lodged ticket by the party. And so we did a very complex preference allocation according to the party's wishes. It changed at this election, and a valid vote was for a citizen to number at least 6 boxes above the line or 12 boxes below the line. The net effect for the Electoral Commission is that the 2013 election, 97% of Australians chose the option of just putting a number 1 in their preferred party box above the line, and only 3% of Australians voted below the line. That made the count for us significantly simple. The count is done by state. The Senate is a state's house. So, for instance, in New South Wales, our largest seat, it meant that only 100,000 people voted below the line, but each of those 100,000 votes then had to be taken to a place we call central Senate scrutiny in each state, and individually data entered, double data entered to make sure there were no errors. Very complex, 100,000 ballot papers, took a lot of time. This time, just in New South Wales, it meant every Senate ballot paper had to go to central Senate scrutiny, so it meant that we had to physically count 5 million ballot papers in the one spot, just in New South Wales, with a very complex series of preferences. And so for us, I had 2 options. We did a big project for this. Our assessment was that for me to be able to enter the data in time, for me to return the writ to the Governor-General, we would have had to have had 900 data entry operators working virtually 24-hour shifts for me to be able to come close to make that. That's just in New South Wales. Or we could implement a semi-automated solution involving scanning, but still human involvement in that. And it means that right now, as I'm speaking to you, we've got, just in New South Wales, 19 scanning pods with custom-made scanners and some 300 data entry operators that at times have been working 24-hour shifts to enable us to double data enter for integrity reasons the Senate ballot paper. Given there was a change to the voting system, we ran a very large public education campaign to educate the public about how to cast a formal vote. That took TV, radio, internet, and a whole range of other forms. It was very extensive. I would have to tell you, it was very expensive. I have not yet provided a public costing for that, so I can't provide that to you here today, but it was in the many, many, many millions of dollars in an effort to educate the public to ensure that the rate of informality remained low. And the other change, for us at least, the first time ever, we were required to register party logos and for party logos to appear on the ballot paper. And again, all of this, the entire project had to be done within 4 months. The figures I've given you just before are for one state, for New South Wales, and you need to multiply that around Australia, which meant that we needed to scan essentially 15 million ballot papers or thereabouts and be able to produce an outcome for that.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Reid.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both presenters for being here today. My questions are going to be for Mr. Pedden, but just before I do that, I want to say to Mr. Rogers, I'm a former resident of New South Wales myself, and was there during during one election, and also at the time of the Constitutional Convention. I actually went to Canberra and sat in on, I think I'm right in saying this, more of the plenary session than any other non-Australian. Some would regard that as a disturbing sign of obsessive compulsiveness. At any rate, very much enjoyed the time I spent in your remarkable country. Turning to Mr. Pedden, I wanted to ask a few questions regarding MMP. The first one, just to make sure I understand this, I got the impression from your comments that it is possible for the same individual to be a candidate both in an individual electorate and also on the party list under your system. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir, yes. You can be, and in fact 70% of candidates are dual candidates. So standing in an electorate and also on a party list.
Okay. If you are on both and you are high enough on the list to have been chosen, do you nonetheless get pulled off the list and wind up becoming an electorate MP? Is that how it's done?
That's right. The process is, and you may not be able to see this, but in the background material we've provided a description of the process we use for allocating the party seats and the electorate seats. And it's following the Saint-Lagu formula. And basically what's involved is that we determine the total number of seats a party is entitled to in the Parliament on the basis of the share of the party vote. We then take the party list and we work through the party list. And if you take, for example, the National Party in New Zealand, the current main party in the government, number one on the party list is the Prime Minister, who won an electorate seat. So that person does not get a list seat. They've won an electorate seat. We go to the next person on the list. It's the Deputy Prime Minister. He also won an electorate seat. He does not get a list seat. The next person didn't contest an electorate seat and was elected from the list, and so on until they get their share of the seats in Parliament.
The next question I want to ask you relates to this. You say in your presentation on slide 5, and I'm quoting, MMP is a proportional system. The party vote largely decides the total number of seats a party gets in Parliament. But I got the impression from your remarks, and you can correct me if I misunderstood, that in fact the party vote, that would be the left-hand side of the ballot paper, actually determines entirely the number of seats that the party will be given. That is, if you get 15% of the votes on that list, you get 15% of the seats, regardless of how you do in the electorates. Is that correct, or have I misunderstood that?
That is correct. So we describe MMP as a moderate form of proportional representation in that it's unlike some systems such as the Israeli system, for example. We have quite high thresholds for parties to pass before they become eligible for an allocation of list seats. So you have to win at least one electorate seat or 5% or more of the party vote. So if you don't win an electorate seat, you win 4% of the party vote. You don't get any seats in Parliament. If you get 5% or more, you are eligible for an allocation of list seats. So if you don't win an electorate seat, but you win 10% of the party vote, you're entitled to 12 seats in Parliament.
All right, thank you. No, that's fine. I have more questions, but I'm at 4 minutes and 50 seconds in my 5 minutes. I'll just stop there and say thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Reid. Mr. Cullen.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both of our guests. I think it's very interesting. We've talked a little earlier with some of our expert witnesses just about representation, diversity in Parliament. I notice that was mentioned, at least in the case of New Zealand, Mr. Pedden, but I wanted to look, Mr. Rogers, in the two houses. This is an interesting example for us here in Canada because you have one country, two voting electorate systems being used at the same time. And I was sent a graph earlier today through Twitter suggesting that the representation of women in the House that's chosen by proportionality versus the alternative vote system is almost double or perhaps double. Is that first of all, is that correct? And second, is that a more or less consistent result over time?
Look, I would have to take that one on notice for you. I'm sorry, I don't have those statistics with me, but I also noticed Mr. Peden's presentation about the increase in diversity as a result of the voting system. I'd have to say from our perspective, the Electoral Commission's perspective, it's not something that figures in the Electoral Act. I know that the major political parties have each set themselves targets for diversity in various categories, and they do report occasionally on how they're going with that, but I'm afraid I don't have those statistics for them.
I'm wondering then, Mr. Peden, can you give us the New Zealand example? Is it mandated at all under the Elections Act, or is it something that parties voluntarily put forward to increase that level of diversity? Because I'm noticing that change over time as well with what goes on in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, one of the benefits that was advanced for MMP by the Royal Commission was that it was likely to result in a more representative Parliament because of the feature of the party list. And for whatever reason, it seems to be the case that it's more difficult for candidates who are women, candidates who are Māori to win in an electorate. It seems to be easier for parties to be able to put candidates, women candidates, candidates who are Māori or Pacific or Asian in winnable positions on the list. And so what we see, the New Zealand experience is that MMP has had the effect of increasing the diversity of the New Zealand Parliament because parties are able to put a wider range of candidates in winnable positions on their list. There are one thing I would emphasise is that there is in our legislation also no quotas, no requirements. This is something which is driven by political parties.
Just a small question. You mentioned the incorporation of logos on the ballot. I believe this was happening in the Australian example as well. Was there a particular, more out of curiosity, simply is there a particular reason? We don't do that. We have the party name alongside the candidate's name. Was the logo included for any particular reason either? Let's start with Australia and perhaps then to New Zealand afterwards.
For a whole range of reasons, that's a political question. But it was to aid voter identification of the political party. So no, I'll leave it at that.
In New Zealand's case, I guess my suggestion was it to overcome literacy barriers or any other issue that was facing voters, that using the symbol, a more recognizable symbol for anyone who's struggling with literacy issues, was this the reason, or was there something else?
Well, it was introduced first in 1995 for the first MMP election. One of the things about MMP is that it recognises as a system the importance of parties, and so the Parliament's intention was to make the ballot paper easier for voters to use by identifying more recognisably the party and also the candidate that represented that party.
Perhaps the last question, is there a distinction made either in the functioning of Parliament in New Zealand between so-called list MPs and MPs that are elected directly? And the second part of that question, is there any distinction made, and this is perhaps more of a cultural question, within the New Zealand community, that list MPs and direct MPs are ranked differently or viewed differently?
Very, very briefly, please.
That's something which, formally, no. A Parliament elected from the list has exactly the same entitlements and responsibilities as a member elected from an electorate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll go to Mr. Thériault. Monsieur Thériault, c'est à vous la parole.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I will speak slowly to ensure that translation makes it all the way to you. What I find striking about your presentations is that there is a significant interest for education in order to make citizens aware of reforms, particularly in New Zealand. There was 18 months between the time when the committee started sitting and tabled its report. Yesterday, we heard experts tell us that representative democracy gives you a great deal of legitimacy to act and to go forward without holding a referendum. I would note rather that 2 were held in New Zealand and that they were supported by information campaigns. I would imagine to ensure that the public, in the end, would be able to understand those reforms. Certain individuals have told us today that a referendum would be necessary given the scope of the change, the importance of the change being proposed. Our mandate ends on December 1st. I have the impression that we're in 1985, where after everyone has decided to change something, and we're forming a committee that will have to table a report, but that committee will have to table its report December 1st and consult the entire Canadian public within the span of just a few weeks. I know that in the institutions of the Chief Electoral Officer are not institutions that take sides or try to tell other countries how it should be done. But do you not believe that our process is moving a bit quickly, given the experience that you yourselves went through?
I think my friend from New Zealand should take that question.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I am able to speak with authority on the New Zealand context and tradition. I'm not at all in a position to comment on what might be appropriate for Canada. That is very much something for the Canadian Parliament and people. In the New Zealand context and tradition, where a reform of fundamental reform of the electoral system has been proposed, it has been supported by comprehensive debate and education campaigns, and has been confirmed by way of a referendum.
I'd simply say that the Australian Electoral Commission is funded for 3 main functions. 1 is to maintain the role, 2 is to conduct elections, and the 3rd one is to ensure there's an educated electorate. And we go out of our way on the 3rd area to make sure that Australians have as much information as they possibly can have to make informed choices.
Merci. Ça va.
Thank you very much.
We'll move on now to Ms. May.
Thank you, and I want to thank our colleagues from New Zealand and Australia for joining us. In addition to being the Member of Parliament here for Saanich Gulf Islands, I'm also the leader of the Green Party of Canada, so I want to extend to you that I've been delighted to work so closely with New Zealand Greens like Kennedy Graham and James Shaw and Metaria Tarai, and in Australia with Bob Brown and Christine Milne and now Richard Di Natale. So I have a rough familiarity from them with the voting systems. And that leads me to ask for Australia, first to Mr. Rogers, has there ever been any consideration, as I've mentioned, the Australian parliamentarians with whom I work, as you'll know, they're all senators, and they're elected under a different system than the one we spent most time on this evening. They're elected under single transferable vote. Do you have any comments on, first, why Australia went to an elected Senate with single transferable vote while leading the lower house with a majoritarian system of winner-take-all?
I think I think that there was some historical artefacts there. The Senate, I'm not sure about the way that the process works in Canada, but theoretically, as you may be aware, the Senate in Australia is known as a states' house and was originally established to be a house of review for the states, and so a different electoral system was developed. Each state has a constitutionally guaranteed minimum number of senators, and so a quota system was developed to help fill that quota. And the only difference is that each of the states, the 6 states, has 12 senators who complete a full term of 6 years, and the 2 territories, the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is, and the Northern Territory, have 2 senators who complete a 3-year term. So it was just a different process that emerged, and people seem broadly comfortable with that, noting the comments I made previously about the recent changes to the Senate electoral system.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I turn to Mr. Pedden, and one of the more unique characteristics of the New Zealand system is having specific seats designated and districts designated for Indigenous peoples, for the Maori people. How does that work? How do you determine, is it a geographical Maori district? Is it a across the country seats reserved for Maoris? And I know, of course, that Maori candidates are electable under the other seats as well. Could you shed some light on how Maori representation works?
Sure. So there has been separate Māori seats since 1867 in New Zealand. A person who identifies themselves as being of Māori descent is eligible to enrol either on the general roll or on the Māori roll. And depending upon the exercise of that choice, when it comes to defining the boundaries, we have a Māori electoral population and general electoral population, and the New Zealand is divided into 64 general electorates and 7 Māori electorates. The number of Māori electorates will increase depending upon the choice exercised by people of Māori descent as to whether they want to go on the general roll or the Māori roll, and all electorates represent the same number of people. So there are 7 Māori electorates because if you divide the Māori electoral population by the electoral quota, you get 7. Does that explain does that answer your question?
Very, very helpful to have the historical understanding that it dates back to 1867. I also wonder, you mentioned that you've done a lot to have education of the New Zealand population about the electoral system. And I'm wondering what you regard as the most effective methods of education that New Zealand undertook to change from our current system, which we want to remove, of first past the post, and move into proportional representation. What were the most effective ways in which this transition was made in terms of public education?
Briefly, please.
And
Okay, what I would say in relation to the decisions made in 92 and 93, they were in the context of ongoing debate that had been underway since the mid-80s. So this was an issue of much public discussion.
Thank you very much. Mr. Corsi.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you both for joining us from afar. I guess my first question I'll direct to Mr. Pedden, and my colleague Mr. Cullen asked about the differences in theory and perhaps in practice in the role that MPs from an electorate versus MPs from a list may play. Adding on to that, is there any evidence to suggest that the public perceives a difference in their roles, whether they actually are the same roles or that they interact differently with the 2 different types of MPs?
List MPs often attach themselves to particular areas or particular constituencies, but in terms of public perceptions, I think it's fair to say that there is evidence that the New Zealand public regards elected MPs, the people that they can go to, as having a higher status than list MPs. But this is an evolving situation, and the other thing that's been found in research is that when people are asked about particular MPs, whether they're a list or whether they're electorate, if they know them and they deal with them, questions of whether they're a list MP or an electorate MP are less important.
And what sort of evidence do you have on how complete or partial ballots are filled out under the MMP system? You know, what percentage of voters check both sides, check one side, check the other side, spoil the whole thing?
So we have very comprehensive data on that because we report on the level of informal votes. Somebody can mark and cast a party vote and not mark the candidate side of the paper. That's a valid party vote. It's an informal candidate vote. They can, although this happens less, they can mark their candidate vote but not the party vote. On average, around 45.45% of party votes are informal. Just over 1% of candidate votes are informal. So the level of informal voting is very low. The level of candidate informal voting is higher because often people will find the party they want to vote for but don't have a candidate either standing in the electorate for that party that they want to vote for. And so often you will find the party vote side of the ballot paper marked but the candidate vote not. 31% of New Zealanders at the 2014 election voted strategically. So in other words, they voted for a different party than the candidate that they voted for.
Is there any perception of a difference in legitimacy of candidates who appear on a list but don't run in an electorate versus those who appear on the list and run in an electorate, whether they win or lose the electorate, and are then placed or given a seat on a list?
There are, for example, there have been very high-profile politicians who are list only. For example, the current Deputy Prime Minister is list only. A previous Deputy Prime Minister and Attorney General was a list MP. So I don't think so. This often, if a member of Parliament or a candidate, a member has aspirations of being a speaker, they will seek a list-only role.
Okay, thanks very much. Perhaps just turning to Mr. Rogers in the brief time I have left, and I can follow up again later. What level of exercise do voters provide for preference 1 through 4, 1 through 5, 1 through 6, whatever it might be, in the alternative vote for the lower house?
If you're talking about the overall level of informality, I think it's about 5% nationally. We do, like the New Zealanders, a very comprehensive survey after each election to work out whether those votes were deliberately informal or accidentally, and our research shows that the vast majority are accidental. It's very clear when people deliberately leave all the boxes blank or write special messages for either the Electoral Commission or for members of Parliament on the ballot paper. That's a
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Kenny.
Thanks to both of our expert witnesses from the Antipodes. Thanks for your time. The first question I have is for Mr. Pedden with respect to the development of the current system in New Zealand. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that in 1992 there was a referendum on the general question about whether or not to pursue a different electoral system, and then options were given in a referendum, subsequent referendum in 1993, after which the current system was adopted, which was then further tested by a subsequent referendum in 2011. Is that correct?
Not quite. The referendum in 92 was a two-part question. So the first question that voters were asked in 92 was whether they wanted to retain the current system of first past the post or change. And then the second part of that 92 referendum asked them to indicate which of four options they would prefer if there was to be a change. And then at the next general election in 1993, because the majority of people who participated in the 92 referendum voted for change, there was a binding referendum at the 93 general election. The 2011 referendum was an opportunity for New Zealanders to, in the words of the Prime Minister, kick the tyres and decide whether or not they, after 6 MMP elections, they continued to be happy with MMP or they wanted to consider a change. So that was also an indicative referendum.
Is the New Zealand electoral system entrenched in statutory or constitutional law?
There is a provision in the Electoral Act which provides for some parts of the Electoral Act a requirement that for an amendment to be made, it requires either a 75% majority of Parliament or a majority of voters in a referendum, and you can find that at section 268 of the New Zealand Electoral Act. The things which are covered are the term of Parliament, the makeup of the Representation Commission and the process for determining boundaries, the voting age, for example, and the method of voting. So those are some of the things which are prescribed as requiring a special majority before they can be amended.
So it's statutory, but insofar as amending these provisions require a supermajority, they might be referred to as quasi-constitutional.
Well, I think we would regard the Electoral Act as a constitutional document, but unlike Canada, there is no. We have a New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, but it is not supreme law in the way that your constitution is.
So it forms part of the unwritten constitution.
Yes, it does.
Okay. And
the tradition is.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Mr. Rogers, in Australia, could you sort of answer the same question about whether electoral law is of a constitutional or ordinary statutory status?
Essentially, it's ordinary statutory process, and in fact, the recent major change to the Senate legislation was passed with a majority in both houses of Parliament.
I understand from a witness we had earlier today that in recent years the ACT held a referendum on a change to its electoral system. Is that correct?
Look, I'm sorry. Given the states and territories have their own electoral commissions, and we love each other like brothers and sisters, but I'm not particularly aware of what they may or may not have done in the ACT.
But the Commonwealth system was effectively adopted about nearly 100 years ago. Is that right?
That's correct, on federation.
Right. While I gather there's no law requiring a referendum for amendments to the electoral system, would it be fair to say that there would be a widespread public and political expectation that any significant change to the electoral system would require approval through a referendum or perhaps something like a supermajority, as is the case in New Zealand?
Brief answer, please.
Look, again, I'm not trying to be unhelpful. I think that's more of a political question. I'd relate back to the recent changes to the legislation that occurred only some 3 months ago. That was a simple majority in Parliament and a major change to the legislation.
Thank you. Ms. Sahota.
Thank you. First, I'd like to start with Mr. Rogers from Australia. Why, I think it's the first question that comes to my mind is why different systems for the Senate versus the House of Representatives? And in your opinion, has there been a lot of debate about moving towards one system for both, or, what are the reasoning? What's the reasoning for it, and what are the pros and cons?
Sure. I think if we go back in history with the Senate system, one of the reasons that the current Senate system has developed was that at various times there's been quite a high level of informality in the Senate vote. And I think if I'm looking here at some dates, I think we went to what we would recognise as the modern Senate voting system in about 1948, with some changes in 1984, and it was in response to the complexity of the Senate ballot paper. And it's still a complex ballot paper with many candidates. I think, and each state paper is different, so I can't give you the statistics for that in any meaningful way. So that's why we went to that system. There has been no overarching public debate about bringing both of those systems into line. It would be very difficult to do that. People broadly accept where we are. The level of informality still remains an issue in both houses, as far as I'm aware, as far as I'm concerned. We've just completed a recount, or in the process of completing a recount, for one seat in the House of Representatives for the election we've just run, and I think the level of informality was close to 7%. In that particular election. It's quite high, and we try and work and bring that down as low as possible. So there's no great public clamour for those two systems to be the same, but there were changes recently to try and make the Senate system clearer for the public.
Clearer? How so? Has there been confusion? Has there been, I know that you have mandatory voting, so everyone has to go out. So how can you tell that there's been confusion?
Again, I'm channeling part of the debate that occurred in Parliament here, but the fact that previously we had the ability for citizens to vote one above the line in the Senate, and for their vote then to be transferred according to a very complex preferential system with each party, led to what some people perceive to be odd results, with some senators being elected with a very small primary vote. And so the changes, the Parliament mandated the changes to the Senate voting system to give people more control over where their preferences went to. That's probably a better way of describing it.
Okay. Another question I have, a lot of our witnesses we had, we talked to academics from Ireland, and we talked to other academics throughout the day. There was a lot of talk about mandatory voting, and that could lead to, no offense, donkey voting is what they were calling it, and that we shouldn't be forcing people to vote if they're not, if they're not choosing to vote and they're not educated on the matter, then what good is their vote? So what is the perception of that? And from your perspective, how do you feel about your mandatory voting system and the level, that you receive in as the results?
I think I mentioned previously our consistent data shows that over 70% of Australians support compulsory voting. And I think we had about 90% turnout in 2016, the election just gone. It does have an impact. I don't have statistics about, donkey voting. From time to time, some people say they don't like compulsory voting. There are some members of Parliament that don't like it. There is a debate that's fairly low level, but broadly there is a large-scale support amongst the populace for the current system of voting.
How much more time do I Okay, I quickly wanted to follow up on my colleague's question, Mr. Payton, about the electorate system and then the list system. A candidate that loses in the electorate system could then possibly be chosen in the list system. Is there, he spoke a little bit about legitimacy. I think that's the one scenario that plays in my mind that may question the legitimacy of that particular candidate. Perhaps not, overall the party, of course, has received that percentage of votes, so you would want that many members representing them under your system. But for that particular candidate, since he has lost, there's been some will to not elect him and then to see him serving as a member of parliament. Is there, illegitimacy when you see that happen?
Briefly, please.
Well, so indeed, the Royal Commission saw the capacity of people to stand on a list and as an electorate candidate to be one of the real strengths of mixed member proportional, because it enables parties to have strong candidates contesting an unwinnable electorate, but being able to be elected through the list, thereby improving the overall quality of the electoral contest.
Thank you. Mr. Blakey.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for what is our evening and talking about your various electoral systems. One of the witnesses we heard today, who is not an advocate for any form of proportional representation, said that one of the real dangers, and he seemed quite worried about this, was that under a proportional representation system of any kind, you would get a serious fracturing of the political landscape, and went so far as to suggest that every major municipality in Canada would develop its own political party that simply put the interests of that municipality first. I'm wondering, in New Zealand under the MMP system, or in Australia for the upper chamber, is it the case that every major municipality in your country has its own political party that simply puts the interests of the municipality first? Was that a consequence of adopting the new system?
Well, the MMP system relates only to Parliament, and the New Zealand Electoral Commission is responsible only for parliamentary elections. We don't govern local body elections. As I said in my opening remarks, there have been 7 parliamentary elections using MMP, and the parties, there have been 6 to 8 parties represented in each of those parliaments. Each of those parliaments have been able to form a stable government and to retain the confidence of the House throughout the parliamentary term of each respective parliament.
To represent their state, but in practice, parties.
So, look, I think the party system in Australia is quite strong. 4 major parties, a number of minor parties. Even in the Senate, which is a state's house, it is essentially run along party lines, and the party system is very strong. So that has not been the experience in Australia, and I would probably say that's the same at state level and less so at local or municipal government. So.
Say then, even in the New Zealand case, that switching to a proportional system didn't mean the end of national parties. National parties continue to be relatively strong and haven't been usurped by narrowly regionally interested parties.
No.
And I guess I'm just curious, in the Australian case, because the 2 houses are elected by different methods, I'm just kind of curious to know, is there a sense in Australia that the verdict of one house, the house that's elected, say, by the alternative vote system, is more legitimate than the other, or vice versa? Do Australians relate differently to the 2 houses based on the way that those seats are elected?
Look, I think Australians are conscious of the role of the 2 houses, but they both Australians respect both houses. And I'm giving you an answer there that I'd certainly give before my joint select committee that has both senators and members in it. So,
in Canada, it's the case that it's usually thought that the Senate, because it's not elected at all, should not impede the will of the lower house in any kind of significant way. there's no kind of corresponding priority rule, if you will, in Australia, given the way that they're elected differently?
No, government is formed in the House, but it's a requirement. The upper house is an elected house. It's a requirement for legislation to have a majority in both houses, and government has to work with that.
Okay. And then how does the government relate to that second house? So you have a government that's formed in the lower house, presumably on a majority, or there's a coalition, or there's a minority government supported by other parties. And then how does it represent itself in the other house? And is it often the case that the governing party in the lower house will have something near a majority or kind of workable majority vote understanding in the upper house?
Actually, I think the last few years, the reverse of that, the government may have a majority in the lower house or a coalition or whatever it is, and in the upper house will have to rely on some pretty strong negotiation with a range of parties to get its legislation through. There are ministers in both houses, by the way. You can be a senator and still be a minister, but I can't remember the last time a government had a majority in both the House and the Senate, but it would have been quite a few years.
Merci. Autour de Monsieur Deltel maintenant.
Thank you. We'll now move to Mr. Deltel. Thank you very much, Chair. And gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be speaking to you today from Ottawa with both of you in Australia and New Zealand. It shows the strength of the Commonwealth.
We'll go to Mr. Robert Peden from New Zealand. Sir, it's a real pleasure for me to talk to you from the first case. In the second round, I will have the privilege to speak to Mr. Rogers. But Mr. Peden, it's a real long journey your country have passed through to achieve what you have done in the last 2 decades. We shall begin with the Royal Commission, 1985-1986. Well, I said 2 decades. We talk about 3 decades. I had the right to vote at that time. But I would like to know, why did you take 18 months to achieve your work as a Royal Commission? Why 18 months?
The terms of reference of the Royal Commission were broad. It included consideration of the electoral system, but many other matters of democracy, and the report was broad-ranging. And one of the things which the report includes, they began with identifying 10 criteria by which they would judge electoral systems, and in the material that we have provided to the committee, we've included the report that the Electoral Commission undertook in its review of MMP in 2012. We reported to the New Zealand Parliament. We attached as an appendix to that report the 10 criteria that the Royal Commission used in judging different electoral systems, and I would commend it to the committee as it continues, notwithstanding the fact that this report was undertaken 30 years ago. It remains a very relevant and very helpful piece of work. And the report in general would reward your consideration. So in answer to your question, why did it take 18 months? It's a very comprehensive, very thorough piece of work which included considerable public consultation and included also visits to international jurisdictions.
But you achieve a lot with that. 18 months, very busy, but very effective. What I've been surprised is that it took almost 15 years to call the shot to the people before any decision. Why so long?
Well, from 1985 to 1993, the two major parties that were then in Parliament did not support first past the post. They supported first past the post, and as I said in my introductory comments, there was considerable public and political debate between the Royal Commission reporting in 1986 and the the decision in 1991 to introduce legislation to provide for a referendum in 1992, which initiated the process that saw the adoption of MMP in 1993, following a binding referendum and the first MMP election in 1996. One other thing I would say, Sir, is that having made the decision to move to MMP in 1993, it was a very busy 3 years preparing for the first MMP election in 1996. A lot of work had to be done.
Okay, just before going to the 3 full years for preparation, let's get back to the 2 referenda. Not referendums. In French, we say referendum, even if we are talking about 2 referendum, but I learned that in English, it's like in Latin, it's a referenda. It reminds me when I was in 1976 in the high school. I have some Latin lessons. So you had 2 referenda. Why 2?
The first referendum was to provide New Zealanders with the opportunity to indicate whether they wanted change, and if they did want change, which alternative system they would prefer.
So I recognize again that you take your time because it's a very interesting and very important issue in democracy. Then you took 3 full years.
We're almost done, Mr. Deltel.
Okay, so we'll get back in the 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure, thanks.
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank you so
Aldag.
much, sir.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to one quick question for each of you, different questions, and I have something that I'm hoping will take a bit more time. So first one, I'll go to Mr. Rogers. And the issue that I want to look at is mandatory voting. When I was out door knocking during our election campaign, I came across 2 religious groups that do not vote. And I'm wondering in your case, if you have any sort of allowance for circumstances like that where people, for religious reasons or other, do not support voting, how do you deal with that?
There's no blanket exclusion from mandatory voting, but the Electoral Act is clear that you may be able to provide what is referred to as a valid and sufficient reason for not voting, and generally religious conviction would be one of those valid and sufficient reasons.
Okay, and what else would fall into that kind of category related to mandatory voting? Sorry, I'm going into a second question, which I wasn't going to do, but I'm interested.
No problems. It's written in a way that the valid and sufficient reason is at the discretion of the local divisional returning officer, but essentially you were not able to be released from work on the day, you were ill, you were genuinely travelling, a whole range of things may indeed be a valid and sufficient reason for not voting on the day. And the way that's uncovered, we write to every non-voter after the election, and they write back to us and explain why they may not have voted.
Well, physical or mental incapacity, again, could be reasons why.
That is correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, moving to Mr. Peden, I just wanted to pick up on Ms. May's question on the Maori seats. And you've indicated that the 7 seats, or the specific seats have been in existence since 1867. Has it always been 7 Maori seats, or is it based to percentage of population, and do they grow over time or change over time?
They grow over time. So in 1867, 4 seats were established. There continued to be 4 seats up until 1993. That was the first occasion when the number of seats would grow according to population. And since then, the number of Māori seats has grown to 7.
And along with that, you indicated that there's not a constitution in the way that we have one, but those seats and that growth would be protected in some sort of legislation or a constitutional equivalent. Is that where those come from?
No, there is an entrenching provision in the Electoral Act, Section 268. It only entrenches a limited number of provisions, and the number of Māori seats and the provision and the distribution of Māori seats is not one of those entrenched provisions.
Oh, okay. Thank you. The question I'd like to throw to both of you, you seem to have, in the case of New Zealand, a new system that you brought on board in Australia. It seems, as somebody coming into it, a bit of a complex system. And again, building on Ms. May's earlier questions about education and how do you build voter awareness and support? And I just would like to hear from both of you briefly, what sort of education campaigns or role of perhaps the state was involved in helping people shift or understand these kind of changes as they take place over time?
I'll start off if that's helpful, and just briefly, we do a number of different things. Firstly, we run a national electoral education centre in Canberra, where over 100,000 school kids a year come through that centre. We reach out to schools and run elections in schools, not all schools, but schools that want us to do that, and a range of other factors focused on youth. At each election, we run a significant electoral education campaign based on awareness of the election, but also how to complete a valid vote. And we use a range of media, social media, advertising, TV, radio, etc. And for the recent change to the Senate, we did a separate campaign to alert the public to those changes. And again, it was a very comprehensive, targeted campaign. So we do those sorts of campaigns at every election. We also provide other services at election time, including language-appropriate voter information officers in polling places where there may be a heavy element of people with English as a second language, etc.
Okay, thank you. And Mr.
All materials, significant materials are translated into about 28 different languages, etc.
We're out of time, unfortunately, on this one, but we'll jump now to our second round, beginning once again with Ms. Romanato.
Well, thank you so much. I'll ask Mr. Pedden from New Zealand if he could actually respond to my colleague's question regarding the educational outreach. I know that Ms. May had also asked the specific question you didn't have a chance to answer, so if you could elaborate on that, that would be great.
Thank you.
Sure. So in relation to the previous question, before every referendum on the electoral system, there were comprehensive campaigns delivered by independent panels, and so back for the referendum in 92 and 93, remember this was before the internet was really a thing, so the public education campaigns focused on radio, TV, newspaper and brochures. There was a brochure delivered to every household. In more for the education campaign delivered before the 2011 indicative referendum on the voting system, the Electoral Commission was responsible for delivering the education campaign there, and we recognised that different people would have different interests, information needs, and so we used a variety of channels and a variety of levels of detail of information to cater for the variety of needs we knew that would be out there.
Okay.
For general. Sorry.
That's great. I actually have one question for Mr. Rogers. You mentioned that the federal level, folks can send in their votes 13 days after Election Day, and there's millions of ballots to be counted and so on. How long does it take from the day after an election to get the results? Because I know we heard from Ireland, and they love the 24 to 36 hours of intense, election day results. But if we're talking 2 weeks, I think my nerves would be shot. So I'm just curious in terms of the turnaround time to get to an election result.
Certainly the 2016 election is the gift that keeps on giving in that regard. Most elections where the result is clear, it is clear on the night, with the result of the primary vote on the night who will form government. It's only when the election is very close that it comes down to a couple of seats, and this election is one of those, but government's already been formed. It's been formed for a couple of weeks, but it's down, the seat that we're now recounting is a very critical seat. So government has a one-seat majority, so every seat is important. But most elections, people will go to bed at some point knowing.
Okay. One last question. You also mentioned in your compulsory voting that you get some data through third party, for instance, driver's license information. Now, here in Canada, we have various jurisdictions, and driver's license information would be under provincial jurisdiction, so there'd be some issues with respect to that. So what would you recommend in terms of, if we were to do something like this, compulsory voting, how would we capture this information, respecting the jurisdictions of the provinces?
Absolutely. Driver's licences in Australia are one of those things where all the states, there is a common database called NEVDIS, National Vehicle Information System. But for other sources of data, sometimes we have to go and have individual agreements with the states. Births, deaths and marriages data is that. However, we use, I don't know what the equivalent is in Canada, Centrelink data, which is our unemployment benefits and those sorts of issues. We get that data federally. Passport data we get federally. We use all of that data to help us work out who's entitled to be on the roll, and where we can work out from that data, we then contact those individuals.
One more time.
Yeah, you have about 45 seconds.
Okay, you know what? I'll leave it for another.
Okay, we'll throw it into the pot.
There you go.
Mr. Reid.
Thank you very much. I thought this time I might start with a question for Mr. Rogers. Just wanted to ask you about, I guess I'll start with this. In the most recent election, votes for senators are now done using an optional preferential system, in which I gather that the key change from the past practice has been you do not have to fill out every single name if you're voting below the line. Is it still the case that for House of Representative seats that there is still full preferential, you must fill out every name or your ballot will be rejected as informal?
Essentially, that is correct.
Okay. And you mentioned then, in the case of the division of Herbert, where currently there's a recount underway in order to determine the winner, that there's a 7% informal vote. Is it possible for you to tell what share of that 7% is the result of voters not having filled out all of the ballot, as opposed to other causes? You mentioned other information being added to the ballot and that sort of thing. But can you tell?
Yes, we will. And once we've finished the entire process, we'll go back and do a survey of those ballot papers, and we'll be able to tell what's deliberate and what's not, and we'll make an estimation about what that is.
All right, thank you. I wanted to ask Mr. Pedden on the subject of overhangs. I think I'm correct in saying that of the various alternatives to Canada's first past the post system, the one that has the most organizational momentum, if that's the right way of putting it, is a multi-member proportional system. Your country is frequently cited as an example that Canada ought to follow. As a practical matter, however, we are a federal system, and the number of seats that is assigned or allocated to each province is constitutionally laid out. It doesn't mean you couldn't have MMP operating at the federal level. It's just that you'd have to treat each province as a little New Zealand. But the number of seats per province is absolutely critical. For example, it actually says in our Constitution there are 78 seats for the province of Quebec, and some of the other provinces have similarly constitutionally entrenched numbers. I raise all of this because this means that the issue of overhang seats becomes constitutionally problematic for Canada. So the question arises, are there examples of multi-member proportional systems that do not involve overhang seats? If such a creature exists, then that resolves our problem. So I realize you don't have that in New Zealand, but are you aware of that?
Well, I'm not aware of that. I know that overhang seats, that the German system is a federal system, and they have a provision for overhang seats. In the New Zealand context, one of the recommendations which the Electoral Commission made in 2012 to the New Zealand Parliament was that the one seat threshold which currently exists, should be abolished. And that if that was to be adopted, that recommendation was to be adopted, one of the consequences of that would be that the number of overhang seats might increase to an unacceptable level. And we've therefore recommended that provision for overhangs be removed. And our advice on the analysis that we did was that the impact on proportionality would be minor. So the short answer is that would be minor. So the short answer is that it would be possible to have an MMP system which didn't provide for overhangs, and you would be able to do the analysis which gave you the insight as to what impact that would have on proportionality. Remembering that MMP is a moderate form of proportionality. It's not an absolutely pure system. There will be levels of disproportionality, and the question will always be, how acceptable is that? Where does it fit in the balance between proportionality and the desire for stable, effective parliaments and stable governments?
Move on to Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Chair. To Mr. Rogers, earlier today we heard from some Irish experts that when looking at other countries' electoral systems, it's often commented from the outside it looks very complicated, difficult to understand how the ballot works, and there's often a fear expressed by those that seek not to have electoral reform take place that any new system brought in will be so complicated that people won't understand it and, in a sense, might be disenfranchised because they don't know how to perform their enfranchisement the way that they want. You've made changes. Has there been any evidence, perhaps not in this past election, it may be too soon to tell, but in previous elections where the complexity of the system has led to lower voter turnout or more of these ballots that we've talked about not being able to be registered? Has there been any evidence? Have you looked for any? Does anyone do any research on this to find out if the complexity of the system has led to any negative consequences?
It hasn't impacted on turnout because, again, we have mandatory voting and mandatory enrolment. Our research shows that there are three factors that impact on informality. One is those electorates where there is a high level of English as a second language. The second of those factors is where there is simply a large number of candidates on the paper. And specifically for Australia, the third factor is where our electoral event occurs close to a state electoral event where they may use a different voting system. So there are three factors that impact on informality. But again, the recent change to the Senate, we really have done a very extensive education campaign. The initial results show that people were well aware of what the requirement was, but we'll have to do a wash-up at the end of that to see whether the informality rate for voting for the Senate increased at this election.
And that entire campaign from start to finish, education-wise, was over a 4-month process, and people were able to pick it up in time and exercise their rights. So I want to turn to online voting for a moment. You made a comment, I don't know if it was in the beginning presentation or in response to a question, but you said that it is massive costs and unacceptable security risks. Where does that comment come from? Is that a personal observation? Is it something Australia has looked at in any specificity? Because it is one of the things this committee is charged with doing here in Canada.
No, that certainly wasn't personal. That was from a 2014 report of the Australian Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which is our parliamentary oversight committee. They did a comprehensive hearing into that and have written a comprehensive report on it. That quote came from that report where they, at that point in 2014, acknowledged that whilst it may be inevitable at some point, pointed out the significant risks that might accrue from electronic voting or internet voting if it wasn't done properly.
The question around this is risks versus rewards. That those that have promoted or proposed online voting have suggested what rewards there may be: ease, younger demographics becoming more engaged, higher turnout potentially, versus the risks that are in place, which is either the lack of confidence from the electorate as to what the results actually are, and we've heard this a number of times already about counting physical paper ballots and whether they be scanned or there's some backup mechanism that's physical, gives people confidence, or the system being hacked. and that the risk of an electoral system actually being hacked and the consequences of that would be difficult to ever know, and you could have, in effect, a legitimate government. Is that what the committee struggled with or addressed in terms of their report?
I think you've summarised that, you know, there's sort of two camps. One of the quotes from the report was that younger people allegedly would prefer to be online rather than inline queuing up at a polling place. But there are also those risks and rewards that you're pointing out there.
A question to Mr. Pedden regarding the lists. One of the opposition to the idea of having party lists is party control, effectively, that some back room somewhere in each of the parties is constructing this list, and that it has smacks of a certain undemocratic feeling that people are placed, very much like our Senate is right now. And is there another way, and as New Zealand looked at other ways that list is constructed, could it be, we've had the suggestion of regional nomination meetings that are done through a Democratic Party process. Has New Zealand looked at any of those other approaches, or is that simply done party by their own preference?
Briefly, please.
So the question of open or closed list is something that has been considered throughout, from the 1985 Commission throughout. Party lists in New Zealand are closed. When we looked at it, our conclusion was that any benefit to be gained in voter choice through open or semi-open lists is outweighed by the resulting complexity. But there's a provision in the New Zealand legislation which requires parties to have democratic processes in the selection of party lists. So
I have a few brief questions. Mr. Rogers. There are two ways of voting, one for the Senate and one for the House. Did that have an impact on the percentage of candidates or senators or independent MPs?
It's hard for me to answer that question other than to say the number of candidates who are standing for the Senate vacancies continues to increase. The Senate ballot paper is becoming very complex, and I think at the election we've just had, the font size for the New South Wales Senate ballot paper was either 6 or 7, which is very difficult to see, to the extent that we had to provide plastic magnifying sheets in the polling place to cope with the size of the ballot paper.
Quel est le ratio? Peut-être ça m'a échappé.
Perhaps it was already mentioned, but what is the ratio of voters to members?
Well, the size of the electoral roll is at this stage 15.6 million people, and there are 150 members of the House of Representatives and 76 senators.
OK. Plusieurs pensent que...
Many think that among the general public, and I will stick to what I know, in Quebec there was an attempt to reform the voting system between 2003 and 2007. One of the criticisms of the first past the post system was that the party line was very rigid. Mr. Pedden, have you heard those same criticisms during debates that led to the changes made to your voting system? If so, if the issue of the party line being too rigid is an important matter, could we end up with the same problems when it comes to respecting a rigid party line if a coalition government were to be formed?
I think that the question you ask, sir, is really one better directed to a political scientist or political commentator rather than an electoral administrator.
Oui, mais je voulais savoir si...
I just wanted to know if perhaps you could summarize for me if, when it came to debate, if there was that in general impression from the public with regards to the party line being very rigid when there were debates that eventually led to changing your voting system. That's the first aspect of the question. I would imagine that this may have come up in some of your documents.
Well, it was the case that the impetus for electoral reform, beginning in the 70s and early 80s, was around dissatisfaction with the way in which First Past the Post was operating in New Zealand. The two main parties which continue to be in existence and now are operating successfully under the mixed member proportional system, very successfully, neither party was an advocate for moving to a proportional system. Notwithstanding that, we went through a process which saw the New Zealand public get to have a say and to exercise a choice to move to MMP. That was the New Zealand experience.
Thank you. We're more or less out of time. On poursuit maintenant avec Madame May.
We'll now move on with Ms. May.
I have a segue to the question I want to ask Mr. Pedden. Is in the deck that you provided to us, page 5, starts with this issue of voter dissatisfaction with First Past the Post in New Zealand, and that it had intensified after the 1978 and 1981 general elections. I wonder if you could tell us how First Past the Post operated in 78 and 81, and the nature of perverse results that led to the voter dissatisfaction.
Well, in I think the 78 election at least, it was an example where, taken as at a national level, there were, the nationwide vote was in support of the party that didn't form government. So in other words, you had the wrong winner scenario, which sometimes occurs under majoritarian systems.
Well, then turning to another one of your charts, the one at page 15, with the diversity in Parliament over the years 1990 to 2014, and the spike in diversity of Asian representation, Pacifica, Maori, and women, what would you say the chances are that the increase was pure coincidence after adopting MMP?
I think the chance would be very low, and I would direct you to slide 16, which shows the same information but taking account of the impact of the list and where people are elected from. And what you can see when you look at that slide is that women are predominantly elected from the list. So 43% of all MPs elected to Parliament from party lists, 43% were elected from the party list. Only 24% were elected from electorates.
That's terribly helpful.
And so what I think...
Oh, sorry. Continue. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to conclude that I think that demonstrates the impact of party lists enabling parties to put women, put Māori, put Asian and Pacific people in electable positions to Parliament.
Well, thank you. I don't think any of the questions this evening, and forgive me if I've missed one, dealt with the issue of voter turnout. Has New Zealand experienced any change in voter participation since adopting mixed member proportional?
New Zealand has been experiencing a significant decline in voter participation since the early 80s. There was a a spike in participation in 96 and 99, but since then the overall trend of declining participation, which is of great concern to the Commission, to the New Zealand Parliament, to the Government, continues. There has been research done on the impact of the change on participation by Professor Jack Vowles, which indicates that the change to MMP has neither impacted, has had a neutral effect on participation.
So the initial spike, was that viewed as associated with voter interest in MMP, or was it seen as not connected?
I think interest in the election, interest in MMP. We survey voters and non-voters after every election, and the reasons given for not voting are that people, in essence, don't believe their vote is important or aren't interested in politics. It amounts to people not valuing democracy and not valuing their vote. And we've done, the New Zealand Electoral Commission has done a significant amount of work around voter participation in New Zealand and what's driving it and what we might do about it. And that's information that we can provide to the committee if that's of interest.
Yeah, I think that might be of interest if it was possible to have further information come to us, because voter participation, we've heard a lot of witnesses to say that really, regardless of the voting system, there's going to be, if anything, a small increase in voting under mixed member proportional or STV proportional systems, but that generally in Western democracies, interest in politics per se is on the decline, which I think is very troubling. Is that your experience? And I'd ask Australia and New Zealand if there's any time left to say anything.
Very briefly,
yeah. I think the point you make is right. That it's a general, it's an issue of concern generally to Western democracies.
Roger.
And clearly we're in a different position with mandatory voting. We've taken a slightly different perspective, but last election we prosecuted more people for non-voting than we've ever done previously. So we are dealing with it slightly differently.
Thank you. Mr. De Courcy.
Thanks very much again. I'll start with Mr. Pedden again this time. We've heard from some witnesses of the need for reform to be delivered in a made-in-Canada style, should we go that route here, and that we should be considering certain values that underpin any system that we may propose. Given the differences in the geographic reality here, Canada being upwards of 9 million kilometres square and New Zealand 270,000 square kilometres, differences in population 35 million to just under 5 million, differences in divisions of power, constitutionality of constitutional differences. What values underpin the system in New Zealand, and where are some of the compatibilities to Canada given those differences?
Well, again, what I would do is commend to the committee the 10 criteria that were identified by the Royal Commission in 1985 for judging electoral systems. When the New Zealand Electoral Commission came to review MMP in 2012, we referred to those and we found them to continue to be relevant. They are available as Appendix B in the 2012 report that has been provided to the committee. They include things like fairness between political parties, recognising the fact that political parties are an important feature of modern politics. Although the first past the post system, for example, operates as though they don't exist. Effective representation of minority and special interest groups. In the New Zealand context, effective Māori representation. Political integration, the extent to which the system brings together diverse opinions. Effective representation of constituents. Effective voter participation. Effective government. Effective parliament. effective parties, and the legitimacy of the system. So those are just briefly the 10 criteria that the New Zealand Royal Commission used to judge the systems that it considered, and it judged that for the New Zealand context and tradition, MMP was an appropriate and preferable alternative to what we then had.
Great, thanks very much. Lots of content that will be helpful. I'll finish with Mr. Rogers, delving more into the relationship between the elected member of the lower house and the electors that person represents. What is the general role played by that person vis-a-vis their local constituency? And is your sense that there's general satisfaction, dissatisfaction with amongst members of a constituency with the person who gets elected under an alternative vote system?
Again, I'm projecting a bit here because everyone's going to have their own view, but I think the system itself is broadly accepted by the community, and there hasn't been a huge clamour, as far as I'm aware, to change that system that you're discussing there. It's a very traditional system, local member, who is very much the local member and represents the local community.
Great, that's all I have. Thanks very much. It's been an delightful day.
Thank you. Mr. Kenny.
Chair, I was so transfixed by Mr. Reid's questions about overhang ballots that I'd like to cede my time to him.
Well, by a happy coincidence, I have a further question regarding overhangs.
Seats.
Yes. Actually, my question is pretty simple. Mr. Pedden, you were just saying in response to my final question to you that you had given advice discussing how it would be possible to adjust the system so that there would be no overhangs. I was going to ask if that information is publicly available and if you could direct us to where we could find it. It would be enormously helpful to us. You can understand that our level of expertise on this matter would be a good deal less than yours.
Well, the New Zealand Commission reviewed, as a consequence of the 2011 referendum when New Zealanders voted to retain MMP, the Commission had a statutory responsibility to review MMP and to recommend to the Parliament any ways in which it thought, after public consultation, the New Zealand system of MMP might be improved. And our findings are contained in our report of the Electoral Commission on the review of the MMP voting system, which was tabled in the New Zealand Parliament in October 2012, and we've provided a copy to the committee, so it should be available to you there. We discuss the question of overhang seats, this particular question at page 20 of that report.
Thank you for that. We'll consult with our analysts who probably have it in their hands right now. I wanted to turn to, or in their offices right now, maybe more accurate. I want to turn to Mr. Rogers for a couple of questions relating to the ballot. I remember when I lived in New South Wales, even then, there was a distinction made between the giant ballots in New South Wales and those in other states, being the largest state with the largest population. I think that the problems you had in that state were worse than the problems in other states. I'm assuming that's still essentially true? And I was going to ask, can you tell me how many names are on the New South Wales ballot?
Look, it's essentially true, but unfortunately, at least from us, from an administration perspective, some of the other states have now caught up. And I mentioned before the need to have magnifying sheets. I think we also had to have that for the Victorian state ballot, Senate ballot paper, and for Queensland. The eastern seaboard states, the most populous states, they are very large ballot papers, a metre long, in fact over a metre long. I can't tell off the top of my head how many candidates, but I think in 2013 there were 180 candidates on the Senate ballot paper for New South Wales below the line. So it's a lot of choice.
One of the things that, one of the impressions I was left with was that the barriers to entry to getting your name on the ballot are relatively low, and this leads to what I would think of as being essentially prank candidates. I remember when I lived there, there was a candidate called Pauline Pantsdown who it was a person who'd actually changed their name in order to mimic the name of another politician, and I think the real purpose that Pauline Pantsdown had for getting on the ballot was to promote a song that was currently playing on Triple J, one of your radio stations. So I say all of this by way of saying that, am I correct that the higher barriers to entry, a larger deposit, for example, to enter, might have the effect of pushing some of these candidates off the ballot and resolving that particular problem?
This matter has been examined in detail by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, and everyone's got a view on this, and it depends where you sit about where your view is. There are some that say that the barrier should be very low to encourage participation, and there are others that say that the barrier should be quite high to make sure that we've got a serious candidate. So we've got a system that we've got, and I think we get some very interesting candidates at every election in Australia.
Right. Okay, but you certainly... There's no doubt about the interesting candidates, but it sounds like then essentially people recognize that the low barriers to entry create a problem, but that the culture, I know it's a very egalitarian place. The culture is such that people feel that's a cost that is less undesirable than the cost of actually raising those barriers and potentially freezing out legitimate candidates. Would that be a fair assessment?
Thank you. Yeah, we very, very briefly.
I actually think you've probably summed that up pretty well. That's probably the prevailing opinion.
Ms. Sahota.
Thank you. I'd like to move to a Twitter question that I got a little while ago. This is to Mr. Rogers. Can you explain the difference between elections in the lower and upper house in terms of the number of women that are elected? We've kind of talked about this a little bit. Aboriginals, minorities, and those with disabilities. What are the differences that you see between the two houses?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the proportion of female, Indigenous or other candidates, but I would tell you that we have said traditionally that Indigenous Australians are underrepresented on the electoral roll, and we are separately funded to try and assist Indigenous Australians to participate in the electoral process, and we have mobile teams that go around remote parts of Australia trying to encourage Indigenous Australians to get on the roll and remain on the roll and vote. But a lot of this is subjective because we don't ask Australians on their enrolment form to identify their ethnicity. So we do a lot of surveys and work to work that out. Young people are also underrepresented on the roll, but we've probably got the greatest level of youth enrolment that we've ever had at the moment, so we've had some success in that regard. In terms of the differences in the two houses, I'm afraid I don't have that for you, but again, I know the parties have targets that they're aiming for, and they report on those targets occasionally.
I forgot to give credit to the person who asked that question. It was Jennifer Ross. But moving on, Mr. Payton, I'd like to ask you about if there were any, after the change that took place in 1996, and when you moved to the MMP system, were there any unintended or unanticipated consequences that you saw after the change?
Well, from an electoral administrator's perspective, no. From the, I suppose, perspective of formation of government, for the 96 government took something like 2 months to form a government. There was a lengthy coalition negotiation to establish the first MMP government. Since then, governments have formed very quickly, and I should just say, in relation to the way that the New Zealand system works, governments, parties, and the public are usually in a position by 10:30 on election night to know the result of the election and for government formation negotiations to begin at that point.
Do you find that having more coalition governments cause instability in your country or more frequent elections? I'm not quite sure how often you have an election there, your term. How long is that?
It's a three-year term. A three-year term in New Zealand, and we've had 7 MMP elections, and to date each government elected under MMP has been a coalition government or had arrangements with other parties, involving other parties. Each government has retained the confidence of the Parliament for the duration of the parliamentary term.
That's quite interesting.
Which I think, yeah.
No, that's very interesting. How much more time do I have?
A little more than a minute.
Oh, okay. Another question, I guess, another thought that's come to my mind is we've talked a little bit about having integrity in our system, and we have a lot of confidence in the Canadian system currently as it is. Mr. Rogers, this question is to you. Having the length of time that it's taking to, come to an election result, and the issue that happened in 2013, has that caused people to lose trust in the system? Because that's something that we hold very importantly, and I'm sure you do as well. We wouldn't want to come across those types of problems in the future.
Look, I think it would be fair to say I've said it publicly. The issue in 2013 with the lost 1,370 ballot papers in the state of Western Australia created great difficulty for us, and it did impact on our public reputation. But we still have a broad degree of public support. We're a trusted institution, and we've worked hard to overcome that. The longer the result takes, though, every time there's increased scrutiny, like an incident in 2013, I'm sure it's the same in Canada, but some of the media commentary occasionally is perhaps strays from the reasonable, nuanced, calm and informed level of public debate that we would like, and we have to deal with that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Blake.
Very much in keeping with the tradition of the committee, I'm going to take a question off Twitter from Julian Lamarche, who asked what I think is an interesting question. In the MMP system in New Zealand, the question is essentially what happens if a list MP decides to leave a party. Do they take the seat with them, or are they really just resigning from the legislature at that point, and that seat gets reassigned?
If once a member is elected to Parliament, the short answer to your question is that if a member chooses to leave the party after having been elected from the list or from an electorate seat for that matter, they remain a member of Parliament so long as it remains. There's no legal consequence. Of course, there are political consequences. The New Zealand experience is that where the electorate takes a very dim view of people leaving their party without good reason, and those members who do so tend to be punished at the next election electorally.
It's kind of reminiscent of a question that we dealt with a little earlier with some other witnesses on the STV system. The question was, what happens in the event of the death or resignation of a member? Or how do you proceed with a by-election under the STV system if a member that was elected in the general election is no longer there?
In relation to a list member, it's simply a case of electing the next person from the list. Obviously, if it's an elected member, there's a by-election.
And in the Australian upper house, where it's an STV system, how do by-elections work?
There's an appointment by the state to the House.
Oh, okay. So who? Okay. So it's a state government then that determines who would fill that seat, or?
Essentially, yes, and there are a whole range of conventions around that based on a very long history in Australia, as you can imagine, that's occurred over many years with various things that have occurred. But there is a convention, and the state nominate a member.
In Australia, for the lower house that's elected on the alternative vote system, do you keep the data, or do you get the data on how the results, the ultimate results in terms of the percentage of seats, compare to people's first choice? One of the themes
we do.
we're discussing a lot is false majorities, and some of our witnesses have suggested that an alternative vote system may not only not alleviate that, but might actually exacerbate the problem of false majorities. Is that something that you guys watch, and if so, what has tended to be the effect in the lower house in Australia?
We do a full distribution of preferences, and all of that data, both current and historical, is available through our virtual tally room, and each seat's different. There's an absolute majority in some, depending on where the seats are located, and in others there's a hugely complex preference flow to end up with the final result. But we do that at every election, and it's very transparent, and everyone's able to see it.
How often would you say parties tend to form a majority in the lower house without having a majority of the popular vote on the first choice round?
I would say that would be rare. On the first round, first preferences. Look, I'd have to examine that. I think what you'd find, there are two major parties, and the Conservative Party is in coalition with another partner. It's very difficult for me to answer that question in any statistically meaningful way, but I can take that on notice and maybe give some thought around that and provide you an answer later on if you like.
Sure, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll go now to Mr. Deltel.
Thank you, Monsieur le Président. So I would like to get back to the conversation, very interesting, that I had with Mr. Pedden. So in our journey, we were just after the referenda, and we had in New Zealand, we had 3 full years, to us 3 full years of political debate, of more political preparation to set the table for the first election. Why did it take you 3 years to have to prepare people for the new way of elected members? To elect members.
Well, the point I was seeking to make is that the decision to move to a new electoral system was made in 1993. The first MMP election was to be in 1996, and there was a great deal of work to be done between 1993 and 1996 to prepare for that election. It was boundaries had to be redrawn. Electorate boundaries had to be redrawn. There was a complete revision of the way in which the chief electoral officers' processes and procedures and the systems necessary to deliver the election, they had to be designed and developed. There was a comprehensive electoral information campaign that needed to be developed, and the public officials who supported the cabinet processes, the executive processes, and the parliamentary processes also needed to review what difference coalition governments and a greater number of parties would make to the way in which cabinets worked, the way in which parliamentary processes worked. So, for example, there were amendments to the standing orders of Parliament to make allowances for the new system. And political parties also needed to adjust. So there was a new nomination process which political parties needed to get their head around. A new campaigning style was required because the party vote became a very important feature of election campaigns, a new thing for political parties to have to understand. All of those things require time.
So we all recognize that you don't lose your time. You had a lot of aspect to face off, to address, and to achieve, to have the confidence of the people before going to a new electoral vote system. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Right. Fast question, a quick question to Mr. Rogers from Australia. You said that you spend a lot of money and a lot of time on education to educate people before the election. Why?
It's one of our 3 roles. We need to have an educated electorate. So before every election, we have a number of different phases of the campaign that we run to make sure people are informed about where to vote and how to vote. And they're 2 very important things.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rogers. Thank you so much, Mr. Pedden. Monsieur le Président, je pense que ce que l'on vient d'entendre est
Mr. Chair, I think that what we've just heard is very interesting and particularly important for the work that we're doing. What we've learned from New Zealand is that it took them 11 years before they made the necessary electoral changes. 18 months for the Royal Commission, 4 years of political debate, 2 years of referendums, and 3 years of preparation and educating the population before making any changes. So from 1985 to 1996, rather, that's 11 years of political debate and teaching the population, educating the population before making that change. I think, Mr. Chair, that the current government should be inspired by the example from New Zealand before making any changes to our electoral system. That is noted. We will now... Are you finished, Mr. Deltel? Yes, I believe so. You still have 45 seconds, but we will finish today's meeting with an intervention from Mr. Aldag. And that will end also our long day of very interesting testimony. So, Mr. Aldag, the floor is yours.
Pete, and I'll start with you. And you might have touched on this. I just can't find it anywhere in my notes. Any of the referenda that were done in New Zealand, what threshold did they use? Were they all the same? Or did they change? Today, I'll tell you, we've heard, that if we're doing a referendum, we should look at a 60% threshold. And yet, I don't think I've seen that. So did you use 50%, 50% plus 1?
Our threshold is 50%. The same basis for the elections of members of parliament. It's that's our democratic tradition. That a simple majority is all that is sufficient to carry a referendum result.
And so
no special majority is required.
I also had a note that to make any changes going forward, such as to introduce online voting, would also require a majority support in referendum. And so again, that would be 50%, a simple majority.
No, I'm sorry, that wouldn't be right. Referenda are required for fundamental changes to the election. When I say they're required, if it's an entrenched provision, one of those provisions which is contained in Section 268, so for example the method of voting, that would require either a 75% majority of members in the House or a referendum to confirm. Any other amendment to the Electoral Act can be made by way of simple majority, but the tradition in New Zealand is that if it is a fundamental change either to the overall electoral system or to some feature of it, such as the term of Parliament, then that needs to be confirmed by a referendum of voters.
Okay. Thank you to both of you for all of the information you've shared with us today. I'm going to conclude with a chance for you to reinvent your systems. And so the scenario is simply, if you could change your electoral system, what would be the one element you would keep? What would be the one element you would part with? And if you could give just a quick why, and that may help us looking at sort of the elements to keep and lose as we move forward. So if you could maybe finish with those thoughts.
I'll focus. Sorry, Robert. I'll focus on administration. I'll focus on administration rather than anything else. For us, the big issue that kills the Australian voting system is the vast number of envelopes that we have to deal with at election time, without the access for people voting everywhere. And if there were a better system for us of dealing with that, it would lead to much swifter results, much more certainty of result, and a better system overall. So I'm focusing on purely the administration of the Act rather than a more philosophical approach to elections.
So as far as the New Zealand Electoral Commission is concerned, our role is as an administrator of the system, which has been adopted by the New Zealand Parliament in consultation with the people of New Zealand. The Commission is not an advocate of any particular system. We're here to explain the system that we have. To provide the kind of guidance that you're seeking, again, I would simply commend to you the report of the 1985 Royal Commission, and also the report that we did on the review of MMP in 2012, where we made a number of recommendations in relation to the particular system of MMP we have and how we saw it might be improved.
A question. So for us to get the 85 report, if it comes through the committee, I guess we would deal with translation and how can we actually to enter it into kind of evidence to be able to draw from? How can we do that? Because I would say to both of you, if you have materials that you would like us to draw from, you can submit written material. And this is one that's been mentioned a few times, and it seems like it may be of use for us to look at. And so I throw it out to the chair and clerk. How can we legitimately have a look at that document without taking years of translation time?
The best approach would be to and we'll look at it and make some kind of determination. So if you are able to send us, it's the 85 report. There's a link, obviously.
We can send you a link to it.
That would be wonderful. Are you finished with your line of question? Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Pedden. I think I speak for all members of the committee when I say I feel I've learned so much, not only about your electoral system, but about your political culture, and obviously that means about your country as a whole. And it's been very informative. You've made a very significant contribution to our study, and as I say, it's really been a pleasure to learn about your systems and your country. Thank you for countries. Thank you for joining us. To members of the committee, demain notre réunion est à 9h.
Tomorrow, our meeting is at 9:30. We'll have 3 witnesses, including Mr. Himmelfarb and Professor Blais. And I would like to note 2 members of the committee that the green shuttle bus is available at from 9:30 to 10 o'clock tonight. So no worries. The buses will be there. So if there's nothing else, I will conclude this meeting, and we will see you tomorrow morning.
I'm sending you the...
Thank you.